I'm going to be talking about another one of my papers, not the one I talked about a month ago, that we think also has, something we can learn something about violence and the determinants of violent crime. Just to motivate, I think, if we think about this question about reducing violence, a lot of times we might hear a case made against leniency in the sense that being more lenient is often thought of as being associated with increases in violent crime or potential increases in violence. You can think back to the Willie Horton story back in the 80s and that type of fear, I guess, of letting people out early or being too lenient and experiencing some horrific violence as a result of that. Just from some recent Google news headlines, I think this is also part of the rhetoric today, in the sense that a lot of this increase in violence is being correlated or linked to potential increases in leniency. So I think our study is going to help it potentially dispel this myth for a certain type of offenders. The general trend, I think, in the US, and it's quite clear over the past few decades, has been towards more leniency, especially for first-time and low-risk defendants. And again, these increases in leniency are often met with fears of increases in violence, as you can see from these headlines, but there's not much empirical evidence supporting this. So what do we do? This is a paper with Mike Mueller-Smith at the University of Michigan, and it recently published in the Review of Economic Studies. And so what we're looking at here is a second chance for first-time felony defendants in Harris County, which is the county that holds Houston in Texas. And we're looking at a practice that's part of a kind of a suite of what you hear discussed as diversion programs in the criminal justice world. And so what diversion is broadly is a practice where, and it can be at very different stages and different levels. So it's a practice where a police officer, prosecutor, or judge provides an opportunity for an individual charged with a criminal offense to avoid a conviction either through a dismissal, so a case dismissal, or the charge is dropped, or the felony is not, the conviction is not upheld through some alternative measure. And so our setting and our analysis is Harris County, Texas. And in this setting, around 60%, so more than half of first-time felony defendants going through the Harris County court system are diverted at the court level. And this is most often through a deferred adjudication. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. And then there are also some case dismissals. And one thing I want to point out is a lot of the motivation behind these diversion programs is, of course, the idea that the second chance might have benefits for the individuals receiving the second chance, but also a lot of it is just managing, extremely high caseload levels within these courts. And so kind of a triage type strategy to help deal with a lot of cases coming through these courts. So deferred adjudication in Texas, just to give you a bit of detail, I won't go into too much detail. It's a lot of it's in the paper. This is essentially an agreement where the defendant admits guilt to the offense and then goes under a mandatory community supervision period, typically around 3 years. And if that period is successfully completed without a further violation or criminal incident, then that initial felony conviction for which they were facing a charge never gets tagged to their record. And so they get a second chance to avoid that felony conviction through this deferred adjudication program. And so the baseline result, and I'll show you this in a few ways, is that we find that providing an opportunity for these defendants to avoid a felony conviction has a very dramatic effect on reducing reoffending rates among those receiving the second chance, and also boosting employment rates by nearly 50% over a 10-year follow-up period. And so I'll illustrate some of these results, but these are enormous effects in terms of the future offending and employment outcomes we see amongst these individuals. And I won't get into the details of the data linkage process, but this is linking court records with administrative employment records from the Texas unemployment insurance system. Okay, so how do we measure the causal impacts of a second chance? And so, of course, a lot of these diversion programs, there's a lot of discretion involved that both amongst the defendants as well as the individuals offering these options. And so identifying a causal effect of these programs is quite difficult. What we do is we look at two very dramatic shifts in the use of the diversion. In this setting, most of this is deferred adjudication changes, one in 1994 and one in 2007. And so these are illustrated by these pictures where these dots represent the average rate of diversion for cases coming to the Harris County Court based on the date of the court appearance. And so here we see that over 60% of these first-time, this is a sample of first-time felony defendants, over 60% are receiving diversion. And then there's a very dramatic 24 percentage point decline in deferred adjudications or diversion in 94 at September 1st, 94. And then in 2007, we see this very dramatic reversal for a completely different reason based on the November 7th, 2007 date. And so just a very quick sentence about each of these changes. There's a lot of nuance behind these changes, but the 94 change was caused by a reform to the Texas Penal Code that changed the attractiveness of the deferred adjudication option for prosecutors. And so that led to this really dramatic decrease in the use of this diversion program. And then in 2007, this increase was following a somewhat unexpected defeat of a jail expansion ballot initiative in Harris County. In the next week, the judges were treating these types of defendants very differently in terms of their use of the deferrals as well as the case dismissals. And so what do we find? Essentially, what we're going to do is compare these defendants that are coming in just before these changes to those charged with the exact same types of crimes, very similar in characteristics, coming through that happen to come through the week after these major changes or the months after. And so that comparison of that before group versus that after group gives us an idea of the causal effect of this program. And overall, we find, as I mentioned, we find very large declines in future offending with diversion. To highlight, what I think everyone's here today to hear about in terms of the violent effects. We don't find the biggest treatment effects on future violent crime, but importantly, we don't find any increases in future violent offending associated with the second chance. So I think that's, it's evidence that suggests that being more lenient in this case, at least, did not lead to these really concerning increases in violence down the road. Just to highlight some of the striking employment effects we see, this is in the 1994 experiment where we can follow these defendants for up to 20 years. Afterwards, 20 years after the treatment, so the diversion, that group that got diverted because they just happened to come in, I guess in 94, it was before the change versus the group just after. 20 years later, we see about 4 full years of employment difference between that group that came in just before and got diverted versus the group that came in after that's similar or identical in observable characteristics. And the analysis of other labor market outcomes suggests this diversion is enabling individuals to find better and more stable jobs when we drill down into the details in the administrative earnings and employment data. And so policy takeaways, I think our study is part of the increasing evidence. You saw one last week, I believe, Amanda Egan and Jen Doliak and Anna Harvey's paper on misdemeanor prosecution. So part of the increasing evidence that stigma, well, I guess that these increases in violence may not result from this increase in leniency, but also part of increasing evidence that stigma associated with a felony conviction plays a key role in depressed labor market outcomes that we see amongst individuals with criminal histories and high rates of recidivism. And so we do a lot in the paper to try to, evaluate whether the stigma of a felony conviction is an important driver, including looking at the effect of diversion for the non-first-time felony defendants and not finding huge benefits, but also not finding big increases in criminal offending amongst that group as well. And so I think this, points to the idea that these increases in violence, these fears, may not be one of the costs associated with increased leniency. But a big caveat here is, of course, our results are based on increased leniency for first-time felony defendants who are mostly facing charges for property or drug crimes in Harris County, Texas. And this is not because we limited it just to these defendants, it's because these changes were mostly targeted or directed towards, or these programs are mostly targeted and directed towards the non-violent offenders. That said, we do have some defendants in that second change in 2007 where the judges just came in and started diverting more individuals after that failed jail expansion ballot initiative. And it's a smaller sample, and so we're limited by sample size, but we do not find that the increase in diversion or increase in leniency for violent defendants facing violent felony charges increased the offending in any way. If anything, it decreased the future offending for that group as well. But again, we're limited a bit in sample size there. And so most of these results are, does this treatment increase violence amongst those individuals facing those property or drug felony charges? And so I will stop there and thank you all for your attention.